Welcome to the Broken Vessels Podcast. Jeremiah 18:4 states, "And the vessel he was making of clay was spoiled in the potter's hand, and he reworked it into another vessel, as it seemed good to the potter to do." This is the Broken Vessels Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Simpkins. This is a podcast where we have discussions on theological themes for the broken to bring encouragement and hope in Christ. And I would like to welcome you back to the Broken Vessels Podcast. And this is a second part of an episode that we're doing on my story of brokenness and redemption through the gospel and through understanding good and proper theology and what that did for me in my life, and really is the reason why I am doing the Broken Vessels Podcast. And I am back here today with my host, Johnathan Eltrevoog. He's kind of been steering the ship. And so, Johnathan, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. I think it's just so cool that, your listeners get the chance to hear, the life and the heart of the person who is hosting this program on a regular basis. And so in the first episode, if you listened to it at some point, basically I'll just give you like a little 1-minute recap. So you talked about growing up in a semi-Christian home, and you always went to church, though. You went to kids club where you learned about the Bible and memorized scripture. You talked about having a fundamentalist background, and you talked about, frequently throughout your youth, rededicating your life, but you really did believe in Jesus, and you felt like the Holy Spirit was always there. You talked about then going to Bible college in Kentucky, and you felt like there was a lot of performance-based things that were upon you, and that was always kind of a struggle. You talked about coming to understand the idea later in life of Christ's active obedience.
Yes. And
how his living for me was just as important as his dying for me. You used the terminology fighting fundamentalists, where you said that the Bible college, this is what we're if we'd be, if you're sitting in the pew and you're feeling real comfortable, well, something's wrong, is the kind of thing. And then you talked about getting married, and I believe you said that was in your senior year of Bible college. Is that right? Yeah,
right after I graduated. It was in 1996, summer of 1996. Yes.
Got it. Okay. And so you talked all about it was problematic from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And then you began to have kids, and you were you graduated from Bible college. You'd never felt really qualified to become a pastor, even though that was what you felt like you wanted to go into, and it never really came together. You moved back to Illinois because your dad has cancer, so you come back to Illinois, and you were living in Indiana, and then you moved back to Illinois because your dad had cancer, and you served in capacities, including candidating for a church, and that did not work out. And so it sounds like we're heading into a season here of life where things obviously are not ideal and about to get pretty rough.
Yeah, very much so. And so, and as I said, there had been a couple of different times where I had taken on, again, being like an assistant pastor or youth pastor or whatever. And again, just the chaos in my home. I didn't stay long. It was like literally at the most 6 months, at each place. Career wise, I was just doing. I've done some things like in warehousing, and then I had gotten into the copier business. Worked anywhere from in the parts department to delivery and setup of copiers. I was kind of learning on the job, and then eventually I became a copier technician, which was kind of cool. And I began to think, well, maybe this is going to be my life. Maybe that's going to be my career, and I'll just be a lay person in church or whatever. I started going through a pretty significant depression. I'd say this was like in 2001. I just was not happy with my life. I was very depressed. I even had a point where I literally didn't go to church for 6 months. I was like, obviously I'm a failure. God isn't pleased with me. My wife is never pleased with me. I don't feel pleased with myself. I it was kind of one of those times when you almost just feel like just giving up on Christianity altogether. Mm-hmm. The thing that's true, though, is that even when you're ready to give up and you want to give up, God won't let you if you belong to him. And he certainly did not let me. And my church back home in Van Orn had gone through several pastors, and really the amount of just a few years. And they had just hired a new pastor. And I had this thought, well, you know what? Maybe we'll move back to Illinois and I can just come in alongside this pastor and just be there to help. And so that was the initial reason for moving back to Illinois. But at the same time, we found out that my dad had esophagus cancer. So again, in the sovereignty of God, God brought me home to be near my father during the last few years of his life, which I was very thankful for, because I saw God do some amazing things in his heart and life. Because as you know, as I said at the beginning of this, he was not somebody who attended church often. He had a profession of faith, but it was very shallow. When he got cancer and was confronted with the reality of death, something changed in him, and he just loved the Lord, and his whole demeanor changed, his attitude changed, and I really believe that God regenerated him at that time, and I'm very thankful for that. And so that happened. Like I said, I did candidate at that church and didn't get it, and I'd been getting pushed by somebody at my home church to come on as a part-time assistant pastor at my home church. And I had a lot of thoughts to myself, like, I don't know if that's a good idea. There's that whole, prophet doesn't have honor in his own country verse, right. And things like that. And I'm thinking, I don't know. But then I thought, well, I'll go ahead and do it. And so I did. They voted me in. I became a part-time assistant, paid part-time assistant pastor. At the same time, I was a copier technician. I was doing a lot as far as I was running the children's ministry. I would preach every once in a while, and then I was just there as support for the pastor. And again, a lot of the pietism began to come in, out of me and really out of a lot of people there at the church too. And I think that whole situation just probably wasn't handled in the best way with the pastor that was there. And I can remember a few years later, after he eventually left the church, I had to call him. I had to tell him how much I was sorry about the way that I treated him, because I should have treated him much better, But and so here I am. I'm trying to live up to what I think are these expectations of all these people that saw me grow up in this church, and trying to be this, Josh, the Bible college graduate, he's come back and come back home, and now he's going to come and minister to us now at our church. And, and I know my mom was real proud of me, and I'm thankful for that, but I certainly was not proud of myself. It's actually kind of interesting. Yeah, I was proud of myself, but I think there was a lot of, I was proud of myself in a way that you shouldn't be proud of yourself. Mm-hmm. It was like, again, in pietism, you take a lot of pride in what you're doing, and then eventually it has nothing to do with Christ. It has everything to do with how people view you. Yeah. So there's a lot of that going on, but there's still all that chaos going on in my own home. 4 small kids, and my wife at the time, and just a lot of back and forth and just chaotic things, because both of us, again, still immature, still don't understand the gospel to the degree that I think if we would have understood it, it would have helped. Well, then around this time, I had an older brother. He was 5 years older than me. My sister's the oldest, and my brother was a year younger. Then 5 years later, my mom and dad had me, and then 2.5 years later, they had my younger brother. Well, my older brother, he had been married for a couple of years, and the woman he was with kicked him out, and it destroyed him. And he was very depressed, and he became suicidal, and he came back to Illinois. He unfortunately committed suicide. And I can remember that day, I was more concerned about a meeting that I was having at church that evening than going out and looking for my brother when he was out with a firearm, and we all knew it. We knew the police were out looking for him. I tried pleading with him on the phone, and he just wouldn't even respond. And I found out after that meeting, I got home and my sister called me and she was wailing and she said, he's gone. And I lost it, completely lost it. I just broke down. I wailed more than I've ever wailed in my life at that point. I couldn't believe it. It was shocking. And my brother was gone, and it completely took me to a place in my mind that I never thought my mind would ever go. And then I began to, there was a lot going on there between me and my wife at the time that really significantly damaged me, because I don't think there was a lot of understanding and empathy about what I was going through in relation to the grief that I was going through with the loss of my brother. Mm-hmm. And I began thinking to myself, man, like, I'm mad at him for what he did, but to a degree, I understand why he did what he did, because I'm going through some stuff right now, and man, like, if I could just check out, maybe that's the answer. That anybody that's dealt with somebody who's committed suicide in their life, and then you deal with depression and things like that in your own life, where you're looking at your situation, and that's the damage that suicide causes, because what it can do is it can put a seed in your mind to think that that's acceptable, that that's an answer to your problems when it's not. Well, unfortunately, it switched something on in my brain that throughout several years after that, I began to struggle with those kinds of thoughts because of the difficulty of my life. And again, would think to myself, well, my brother did it. I mean, he doesn't have to deal with all this anymore. Maybe he had something, maybe he figured something out. And that's an unfortunate effect of dealing with somebody that commits suicide. So,
and that's so sad. And what a just awful thing to live through. And anybody that's lived through this that might be listening, to have some degree of understanding what you're dealing with at this point in your life. And it's not as if your life was going great and then all of a sudden this happens and then it takes a dive. It's that things were already hard. I mean, you had your dad, had your dad passed away at this point yet?
He hadn't yet. Okay. But then this happened in November of 2003.
Okay.
And then my dad passed away from cancer in August of 2005.
Okay.
And another thing had happened within this time frame, right after my dad passed away. So I had a cousin who he was going through a divorce. He was struggling. And then again, he was my brother's cousin as well. So he saw what my brother did, and he began to entertain these thoughts. I can remember being at my younger brother's wedding, and I was talking to my cousin, and he was saying, I really understand why your brother did what he did. And at this point, I'm like, dude, you can't be thinking like that. You can't do to everybody what my brother just did to us. Mm-hmm. It's going to destroy your mom and dad. You can't think that way. And he's like, yeah, I know. I get it, and I told him, I said, I get it too, but that's not the answer. And unfortunately, not very long after that, I got the news that he had killed himself. And so there was another loss, within that time. So my brother, my dad, my cousin, and that plays with your brain, especially when you're dealing with the things you're dealing with. And so after my brother committed suicide and everything was very difficult, and my wife and I were going through a lot of chaos at that time, I resigned from my home church. I felt like just defeated, deflated, a failure, that I couldn't handle this tragedy and still do all the things, right? Mm-hmm. And so we made the decision to move back to Indianapolis, and we did. And so we were there, and again, a lot of ups and downs. I did go to another Bible college there to try to further my education, commuted, took classes, and it was a little bit better than where I had gone. And so gone through that, and then eventually things, again, I was struggling on and off with depression. I was struggling on and off with suicidal thoughts myself. I actually spent a couple of times in the hospital for mental health reasons because I was struggling so much, and it definitely was causing a lot of even a further rift between me and my wife at the time. And we separated in 2008, and I really thought we were going to get divorced at that time. And I had some other friends that I had, another former Bible college roommate who was in Utah and planting churches in Mormon land, as they call it. Mm-hmm. And he and his wife invited me to come out and just to kind of de-stress or whatever and just come help them. They were doing a building project, and so I agreed to do that. So I went out there to Utah, and I loved it. It was beautiful. I just loved the area, and I thought to myself, well, maybe this is a new start. And within that time frame, from about January to March, my wife and I at the time were trying to figure things out, and eventually we came to the point where we decided to reconcile. And then she and the kids moved out to Utah in June, and we decided, okay, we're going to start our life over again here. Well, it was okay for maybe a month or two, and then things again began to devolve. It really never ended, really, to tell you the truth. And eventually, by 2013, we ended up not having a church home, and we decided to try a new church. And another thing that's interesting is that right before this time, I had started candidating at churches again for ministry positions because I felt, to the point, at least the chaos had dialed down enough that I felt like maybe I was ready. Mm-hmm. I literally candidated at a church in Alaska. I candidated at a church in Boulder City, Nevada. I candidated at a church in Oklahoma, and they actually voted me in, and then I declined it because I just saw some red flags there, and I thought to myself, no, I don't think I'm going to do this. Really, all of that was by God's grace. And then we were trying to find a church home, and we found this church, and I met the pastor there, and there was something different about this church. And surprisingly enough, it was very interesting that I found a church like this in the middle of Utah, where it's mostly LDS, Latter-day Saints, Mormons. And I started getting to know this pastor, and I'm like, there's something different about this guy. Like, he keeps on talking about God's covenant with his people. He talks a lot about covenant. He talks a lot about being reformed. And I'm like, what does that even mean? And so I had an understanding of what Calvinism was, but I didn't completely understand all of these things and, the gospel and the way that he was explaining it. So it was a little different. And I started having conversations with this guy. Well, this guy's name was Brett Revlett, and he's been a host or been a guest on this show because we're still lifelong friends, since 2013. And Brett really helped me work through theology and understanding what the gospel is and what grace really means. He helped me understand why covenantalism is so much better than dispensationalism when you're coming to understand Scripture. And he helped me to grow and learn. I hate to say it, but, I was coming to this way of understanding, and I don't really know that my wife was coming along in the way that I was. And many times it would even cause arguments. There was some toxicity there because even the differences that were happening within our theological differences, and it made things difficult. And eventually it culminated in 2017. I'd already become a truck driver. And, even though I was growing in my knowledge of Christ, I was struggling in my personal walk. I was struggling again in my pietism and things that would still bleed out. And then in my own heart, I was dealing with some dark sin in my own heart that I wasn't willing to deal with. And there came a point where I went to my pastor one Wednesday evening, and I confessed it to him. And I'll never forget, he smiled, and he was even like giddy about the fact that I had confessed this to him. And he was like, brother, he said, don't you feel better now? And I was like, I do. And he's like, well, you know what you got to do now? And I was like, yeah. And I said, I know it's not going to go well. And he said, yeah, because he had already tried helping me and my wife with marriage counseling. It didn't go well. It just didn't go well. And so, you know, I confessed it to her, and she did not take it well. And I didn't have like an affair or anything like that, but there was like sexual sin that was a part of it. It wasn't like having an affair or anything like that, but definitely sin of the heart, the mind, and even in deed in some sense of the word, but not like having a full-on affair with anybody or having, you know, extramarital sex with anyone or anything like that. And it was significant, and I was wrong, and it was sinful and wicked. And, but I was so tired of living lies and living in chaos, and I was tired of it. I was tired of the perpetual hamster wheel, and this understanding of Reformed theology and the grace of God and the gospel was telling me, you don't have to keep on trying to sustain this life. You can rest in me. You can rest in who I am. And you don't have to keep trying anymore. You can just come to me and be washed clean. And that's what I wanted. And that's what I was longing for. Which is a beautiful
thing, but some facets and features of fundamentalism don't care for that.
No, not at all. Not at all. Thankfully, my pastor did. At the time, I mean, God really brought him into my life in his sovereignty. You know, I think back to some of the pastors that I've had in the past, and if I would have went and confessed something like that to them, it would have been all condemnation and just nastiness. And I don't know, man. I don't know how it would have went. But with Brett, it was just love and grace and care. And man, dude, like, I get it. You're a sinner just like me. I mean, that's, that was his attitude. And I'm like, this is not what I'm used to, but it was so helpful and so gracious and so wonderful. Well, things again devolved continually into that chaos. And then in 2017, and again, like I said, I struggled with depression on and off. I struggled with suicidal thoughts on and off, again, because of that seed that was planted in my mind because of what my brother did. And it culminated in 2017 when me and my wife at the time, things got really bad. And I was ready to give up. I can remember sitting in front of Brett's house, and I was just like, he was standing outside, and I had my window rolled down in my car, and I was just like, I was at a place where I was not healthy mentally or emotionally because of everything that was going on. And he said, brother, why don't you just come in and let's sit down and let's talk. Let's have a cup of coffee. And I just told Brett, I said, no, man. I said, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. And I drove off, and we had a mountain range there just in the Ogden Valley, there in Utah. This is in Utah, and then near Brigham City, which was where our church was and where Brett lived. And there's this mountain range, and I'd been up this mountain many times, and I drove my car about halfway up the mountain, and I found me a spot up there, and I had made the decision I was going to kill myself. And I did. I attempted it. I hooked a hose up to my tailpipe, stuck it in my window, and I had that kind of that. There was still that part in me that was like, you can't do this. You remember what your brother did and how much it affected, and how's this going to affect your kids, and how's this going to affect everyone? But when you're in a place like that where everything is so dark and you just want to give up, it's hard to think straight, right? And so I was texting back and forth with Brett, and he was like, you need to tell me where you're at. And I'm like, I'm not telling anybody where I'm at. Well, we had a deacon in our church that was a police officer, and he had been out looking for me. And I remember I was just sitting there, and I just was going to, I had the decision, I'm going to drift off to sleep and I'm not going to wake up. And in my mind, this is where your mind goes. I'm being absent from the body. I'm going to be present with the Lord, and I'm not going to have to deal with my sin or anybody else's sin or the chaos of my life any longer. And I'm just going to give up and I'm going to go to heaven and it'll be much better. That was the thought I had in my mind. And it was wrong. It was wrong. And, but that's where I was. And interestingly enough, all of a sudden I see this police car drive right, and 1 in a million, dude, chance that this guy was going to find me where I was at. 1 in a million chance. And it was the deacon from my church that was a police officer.
Wow.
And he got there just in time. And he knocked on my window. He said, you need, and eventually I relinquished the keys to him. I turned off the car. They got me out. He called an ambulance. They came up. They checked my oxygen. They said if I would have went another 5-10 minutes, I probably would have been dead.
Wow.
And they took me to the hospital. And, of course, I had to go after getting checked out, I had to go into the mental health ward and everything. And I was so depressed. I was in a very dark pit at that time. And eventually I was released. And my wife would not allow me to come back home. And so I had some other friends there that let me stay in their camper outside their house. And I was still, I was like, I was at a point where I wasn't ready to do it then, but I had in my mind, well, eventually I'm going to do it and nobody's going to stop me. Well, my buddy and his wife, they went on vacation, and I made the decision, this is going to be it. And I sent an email to both Brett and to this guy, my friend Mark. And then I went into his garage and I started his truck and I laid down in the bed of the truck. And I was sure it was going to happen that time. And this was literally a month later. Next thing I know, I hear somebody knocking the door down, and it was the police. And again, they carted me off again. And I saw the same guy in the emergency room. He goes, dude, what are you doing? He said, you almost did it again. Oh. And I was like, yeah, well, that's what I'm trying to do. That's what I had in my mind.
How did the police know to go into this closed garage?
Well, again, sovereignty of God. I had sent these emails. Brett didn't get it until the next day, but Mark just so happened to open his email that night. And he said it was a fluke thing. He was like, I wasn't even planning on checking my email, but he said, I just decided to check my email. And he said, I got that email just at the right time. He said, I wouldn't have got it until the next morning. And he said, you'd be gone. Wow. It was God. God intervened. And I know he doesn't intervene with everyone in that way, and I understand that, but it was totally God. It was a miracle that God did not allow me to go through with it the whole way. He just didn't allow it. He wouldn't allow it because he had a plan for my life, and I knew that. So yeah, and I was literally in the hospital for a month that time, and I came out still very depressed. Things were not good between me and my wife. And then we had a huge fight, and I left, and I took a plane to Illinois, and I was like, I'm done. And surprisingly enough, I was disciplined by my church for abandonment at that point. But I was in a frame of mind that I just didn't care. But I had from my friends like Mark and another guy, and then Brett. I would try to communicate with him. And eventually I was convinced to come back and to repent and to be restored and to try to, I guess, one last hurrah to try to make it work. And so I did. I came back. I was restored. The church accepted me back. My wife at the time had said that she accepted my repentance and supposedly to a degree had forgiven me, and that we were going to work on marriage counseling together and all of that. Well, it started off maybe okay right at the very beginning, but it devolved again very quickly. And then she decided she wasn't going to do marriage counseling anymore. And then eventually she booted me out. And at this point, God was changing things in me. I wasn't angry as much anymore. I was just sad. And I don't know, God was doing something in my heart at that point. There was a lot going on. We separated for the last time at that point, and the church pleaded with her for us to try to work things out. She was done and she was over it, and then she left with the kids, and that was it. And then I didn't know what I was going to do from there, and eventually I made the decision to move back to Illinois. She had moved back to Indiana with my kids, and we got divorced.
And what year was this?
This was in 2018.
2018, which is probably a good point to pause at this point.
Yes.
I mean, I just want to quickly recap. When we talk about broken vessels, I think this is why you named the podcast Broken Vessels, because, you know, you have just described to us, especially in this episode. I mean, it started in the last episode, but here in this second episode, you've really gone through the brokenness. You've painted a very clear picture of the brokenness. It didn't have its complete beginnings in 2001, but you started talking about having a depression and how relatable, how many people began to have depression right around the 9/11 time. But then, you know, you're talking about all these things, and you have your brother who committed suicide, your dad passing away in 2005. You had your cousin taking his own life. You had this resignation from your church. You had, you know, these suicidal thoughts start to come to mind, hospitalization, separation, you know, moving across the country. I mean, you know, they have these tests that you can take for like how much trauma can a person handle. And you're real high on the list at this point. But thank God, you know, God brings this new church into your life in 2013 with Brett, and you begin to learn things. But unfortunately, you and your wife are not on the same page. And then all these things happen starting in 2017, and there are two different attempts on your own life that you've taken, and God says, nope, that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. And he did not allow that to happen. And then, you know, all these things end up culminating in the end of your marriage in 2018. This may or may not be an appropriate question to ask, but I've learned to just ask the things that are on my mind, and you can edit it out if you want.
Okay.
But the question here I would just ask at that point was, what do you think, you know, when you've had this well-established troubled marriage, and at that point, you know, you said the suicide attempts began in like 2017. What do you think it was, besides that lingering suicide idea from your brother and cousin that you said kind of gets in there? Why do you think that you were going in the direction of suicide as opposed to, you know, maybe as bad as the divorce would be, maybe I just move on from this, whether or not I feel like I have biblical grounds, you know, move on and do something different rather than giving up entirely? Like, you must have wrestled with that idea, and I'm just curious what was going through your mind, if you want to share that.
Yeah. And really it comes from a place of, I think, a bad understanding of marriage, divorce, and remarriage biblically, which I have a very different understanding of that now. But I had much more of the fundamentalist understanding of that. Basically, the only options in my mind were stick with this horrible marriage or die. I didn't feel like there was any hope past that. Like, if I got divorced, that was like the end of my life. That's the thoughts that went through my mind. I didn't even think that was an option, really, you know, because I felt like once I get divorced, man, that's the end. Because no, again, in my mind, you know, I want to be in ministry. And I thought to myself, well, no church is going to touch me with a 10-foot pole down the line if I get divorced. So that, you know, so I can't. And
of course, that's, which isn't true, but that of course, and again, I'm not trying to slap labels on all people that would identify themselves as fundamentalists or this way, because I'm sure that's not true. But how toxic, and I'm going to go ahead and even say lethal, is this type of thinking that it was either you get that marriage together or you're going to die? Like, that is a lethal thing that certainly that was never said in a sermon, but something happened in these groups that made you feel that way.
Yeah, definitely. And then, of course, you know, there was the thought of my kids. I didn't want to let my kids down. But the bottom line is this. When I look back on, we were married for 21 years. Okay. That's a long time. And that's a long time to be in a toxic relationship. And it does something to you. It breaks you. It does things to you that you can't even imagine. And I know there's people listening to this right now that know exactly what I'm talking about. Here's the thing. I look at what it did to my kids. You know, the chaos that went on between me and my ex-wife. I look at what it did to my kids, and I think to myself, you know, if we would have made the decision to get divorced in 2008, I actually think it would have been better for my kids. But we chose to stay together and to continue the toxic relationship, and it affected my kids even more than I think it would have. Many people say divorce affects kids in ways that you can't even fathom. I'm sure that it does. I know that it does. But I'm going to tell you right now, staying in a toxic relationship where God is not glorified and there's chaos constantly, I'm telling you right now from my own experience, it affects kids way more than going through a divorce, and in very detrimental ways. That's just the way that it is. But
yeah,
yes.
And I know that's coming from a person who I know and love very much, which is Josh Simpkins, who, I've had just untold numbers of hours talking with you, particularly later on in your life. But, so when he's throwing around words like toxic, this is not just the buzzword that our culture likes to use, but there are truly things inside of a relationship that are this way. And unfortunately, this is the way that's gone. I think I can almost hear you making a mental note in your mind saying, I'm going to do another episode one day on marriage, divorce, and remarriage.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely going to do that. But yeah, I think this is a good place to stop, but right here at the end of a 21-year marriage. And then just to kind of put a pin in it here, I can tell you that when that happened, there was a lot of things happening at the same time in my own heart. Like I said, I started seeing things change in a way that I didn't like it was enlightenment from the Holy Spirit, truthfully, about it, to a point that I didn't have any bitterness or anger or like I had previously about like the fact that she left, took the kids. I mean, I was sad. I understood why we were where we were, and this is it, and the fact I had in my mind too, I just can't do this anymore. I can't do really the hamster wheel of our marriage, which was just chaos and then trying to make it work. And then it was like a hamster wheel, really very much so like the pietism that we came out of. And again, like I said at the beginning of this, all of that bleeds over into your personal life. It has an effect. But a lot was going on, and I felt like a freedom in a sense because I wasn't under all that stress and pressure that it opened a door for God to really start working deeply within my heart. And so we'll just leave it there for now. Brothers and sisters, I really hope that you'll stick with us here because we're going to do one more episode because we're going to get to the good stuff in the next episode. I hope you'll stick with me. I hope that as you've listened to me share my story, that you will be encouraged that you may be going through very difficult things, just like I've gone through in my life, just like Chad Bird talked about him going through. I can tell you it's not easy for me to share this on a public platform, to expose myself, to show you all how broken my life has been. But there's freedom. There is freedom in honesty and transparency and in sharing your brokenness with others, because you can bring encouragement to others by showing them that, hey, I've walked in your shoes, or I understand what it means to be broken. That's what this podcast is about. And I want to be able to share my story of brokenness with you so that you understand I get where a lot of you are at, and that's the reason why I do this. And I want to thank Johnathan again for being here to help steer this ship, so to speak, and he's going to stay on and continue to steer the ship on our next episode. I appreciate that, Johnathan.
My pleasure. Thanks for having this.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining the Broken Vessels podcast, and stay tuned for next week.